The secret brotherhood behind Assassin's Creed came from an actual medieval order. The Nizari Ismaili ran their network from the fortress of Alamut. Masyaf stood as one of their strongholds. Jerusalem sat at the center of a crusade that erupted in 1189. That's why today, I'm breaking down 10 true historical events hidden inside the Assassin's Creed games and how much of each one actually happened. Starting with the war that gave the entire franchise its name and its first battlefield. The Third Crusade. Historical timelines place the fortress that gave Assassin's Creed its hood, its hidden blade, and its name in continuous operation for 166 years, ending only when the Mongols besieged it in 1256. That fortress is Alamut. The entire premise of a secret order picking off powerful men one at a time started there, long before Ubisoft existed. The Third Crusade, which the first game uses as its backdrop, began in 1189 CE after Sultan Saladin retook Jerusalem from Christian hands and forced 3 European kings to answer for it. Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all set out for the same city. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia before he reached it, and the two who did arrive spent as much energy competing with each other as fighting Saladin. Masyaf, the game's home base, sits on real ground. It was a Nizari Ismaili stronghold in Syria, one node in a network of fortresses running from Persia to the Levant that had operated for decades before the Third Crusade started. Several of the game's named targets are pulled straight from the historical record, though others, like the arms dealer and the slave trader Altair Hunts, are fictional characters invented for the story. For the historical figures among them, their titles and their place in this war come straight from documented history, even though their on-screen deaths are invented. Altair spends the whole game hunting 9 men whose deaths change nothing about the war. Richard and Saladin are already fighting. He wins every blade fight and still watches Jerusalem's siege play out exactly as history already wrote it. One piece of that inheritance gets rewritten on the way into the game. The real Nizari were a specific Shia Ismaili sect, fighting for a theological claim to leadership, killing for religious survival, while Crusader and Sultanate factions alike wanted them erased. That devotion is the detail the franchise trades out for a modern secular creed its actual founders never spoke. The Crusades gave the series its name and its mythology, but the next era it visits is one where the history itself was already so theatrical, so corrupt, and so full of documented villains that the games barely had to add anything at all. The Borgia Conspiracy. Cesare Borgia died face down in a ditch outside Vienna, stripped of his armor by soldiers, his power reduced to a body in a field. His father spent his papacy buying him armies and titles. 30 seconds outside, a nowhere Spanish town erased the investment, and the men who cut him down filed no special report, because to them he was just another dead knight in a field. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, and the 11 years that followed produced one of the most infamous papacies in European history. Assassin's Creed II and Brotherhood plant Ezio directly inside that court, treating Florence and Rome as one continuous crime scene the family runs from behind closed doors. Every city the game hands you as a playground, Florence, Venice, Rome, was a genuinely separate power with its own army and its own grudges, and the Borgia spent years turning that fragmentation into leverage. The real material practically writes itself. The Pazzi Conspiracy, a genuine 1478 plot to gut the Medici family inside Florence Cathedral, reads like the blueprint the series would adopt for elite betrayal. Niccolo Machiavelli and Leonardo da Vinci worked, wrote, and built inside this exact Roman and Florentine world, while the Borgia climbed, real people embedded in the same civic life the game recreates around them. The first real history this franchise borrowed belonged to a medieval order so obscure many players had to look it up. The Borgia needed zero introduction because the historical record already had them filed as monsters before Ubisoft ever touched the material. Rodrigo's corruption, Cesare's political murders, and the family's grip on the papacy are all genuinely documented, flattening 2 decades of opportunistic power grabs into one coordinated secret order with a unified master plan is where the drama takes over, because a family of ruthless improvisers plays a lot less cinematic than a family of criminal masterminds. Cesare wanted an empire he could hand down like a title. He got a ditch and a stripped corpse. His death has become a byword for ambition outrunning its own army. The Borgia overreached, and Rome simply absorbed the loss and moved on with its business. Somewhere else on the map, a city was still carrying the full weight of two collapsed empires on every street corner, with nowhere left to put it down. The Ottoman siege, Ezio Auditore, stands in a city that already survived its own apocalypse 60 years before he arrives. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, and the empire absorbed the old Byzantine capital whole, turning it into the strategic and symbolic center of its own imperial project. Assassin's Creed. Revelations builds its entire setting on top of that inheritance. Cesare Borgia's Italy ran its plotting through single households and single cities, a cardinal's bastard son clawing his way through Florence and Rome. Constantinople runs on a bigger clock. Byzantine churches still stand under Ottoman administration. Byzantine street plans still route Ottoman traffic. A Byzantine merchant's grandson could work the exact market stall his family lost, selling spices to Ottoman customers who inherited an entire capital city without bothering to rename half the streets, and the empire now running that city was still tightening its grip on the same ground. That consolidation is where the game finds its drama. Early 16th century Constantinople sits at the crossroads of dynastic succession tension, with imperial institutions negotiating authority against regional power blocks across the eastern Mediterranean. This is the actual historical hinge, the moment medieval power structures give way to an early modern state apparatus, and Revelations plants Ezio directly inside it, with Altair's older story bleeding through the same walls from 3 centuries earlier. Revelations sharpens that atmosphere into a specific succession plot with assassin stakes attached, a conspiracy engineered to feel personal and immediate. The documented history gives the broader condition, a city and an empire mid-transition. The specific plotted conspiracy is where the writers took over, aiming a real fault line, one wide enough to swallow a religion and a royal family into something a player can chase down an alley. A Florentine plot cost a handful of powerful men their lives. A Constantinople plot sits on top of a city that already changed owners once, completely, with an entire civilization's memory rewritten into somebody else's capital. The fictional order operates at a genuine disadvantage here, buried under a couple hundred years of actual empire, chasing personal drama through a city built from a much bigger one's defeat. 2 empires occupied one city, and the stakes had been building for centuries before Ezio and Altair ever crossed paths in the shadows of Masyaf. The next fight on this ladder happened somewhere the ink was still wet, where the people living through it knew exactly what they were building. The American Revolution. The story America tells about its own birth was largely finished before Assassin's Creed 3 ever handed you a controller. 2 centuries of classrooms had already sanded the mess of the revolution down into something that reads like a movie script, complete with a beginning, a middle, and a flag at the end. That is the specific trap this game walks into, one the Ottoman city never had to face. Constantinople was a battleground for control of a captured capital. The 13 colonies were a battleground for the meaning of a story Americans already agreed on before the credits rolled. The game's timeline runs primarily from 1773 to 1783, and it hits the era's landmark moments directly. Colonial protesters dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor in 1773 to protest British taxation, and the game recreates it beat for beat. Tensions had already turned deadly 3 years earlier. British soldiers shot and killed 5 colonists and wounded several more during the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, an event colonial printers turned into one of the most effective pieces of propaganda of the entire resistance. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere rode out to warn colonial militias that British troops were moving on Lexington and Concord, and the game puts its protagonist directly inside that ride, next to a man history had already turned into legend before he finished the trip. By the time Ubisoft got to it, the revolution had already been rewritten once, by the country it created. Minutemen became folk heroes, a night of tea dumped into a harbor became a symbol, and a shooting on a snowy street became the spark that lit a war. The game layers fiction on top of a story America had already spent 2 centuries mythologizing on its own. Connor, the game's assassin, fights to protect his people and his land, and by the time the war ends, he has won individual missions while losing almost everything that actually mattered to him. Historically accurate, emotionally brutal, very on-brand. The founding myth the game leans on has room for redcoats and patriots. It has far less room for the loyalists who lost their homes, the enslaved people the Declaration did not free, or the indigenous nations whose land was a central prize being fought over. Nothing in the game openly confirms an intent to erase that story, but a hero-shaped lens narrows a genuinely crowded war down to two sides and one clean outcome. The Revolution handed one nation its origin story, printed in schoolbooks and absorbed by generations of children who were frequently not shown what got left out. The series' next stop is open water, where survival depends entirely on nerve, and every rule is whatever the strongest hand on deck decides it should be. The Golden Age. Blackbeard lit slow-burning fuses inside his beard before combat. The smoke pouring from his face terrified enemy sailors into surrendering before a single shot was fired, and Edward Teach appears to have understood that his reputation was worth more than his cannon. Genuinely his most effective weapon. He was performing his own legend in real time as a deliberate strategic instrument 3 centuries before a game designer put him on a loading screen. That is the part Black Flag earns. The man the game depicts was already doing the work of myth-making while he was alive, which puts Ubisoft in the odd position of being late to the romanticization of a figure who had romanticized himself first. The conditions that made him possible arrived by accident in 1715. A hurricane struck the Spanish treasure fleet off the Florida coast, sinking 10 ships and scattering 14 million pesos in silver and coin across the seabed. Spain's entire colonial freight system had a catastrophic single point of failure, and a storm exposed it. Salvage crews arrived, so did the pirates. The wreck sites became a supply chain, and the Caribbean suddenly had a generation of well-resourced operators with no immediate war to suppress them. Nassau was where they landed. The Bahamian settlement had changed colonial hands enough times that the colonial powers themselves could not agree on whose hands it was in, which suited the people occupying it perfectly. The settlement ran without reliable governance during this period, its port drawing a steady stream of privateers, deserters, and opportunists from across the Atlantic. The game calls this the Pirate Republic, a loose experiment in freedom before empire. The documentary record describes a crowded, violent, unstable settlement where the leadership question was permanently deferred. Calling it a republic works in the structural sense, the sense that the paperwork had gone missing. The player in Black Flag spends most of the game trying to hold that space together and loses it anyway. Nassau falls, the pirates scatter, the Empire reclaims its receipts. Edward Kenway wants the freedom and ends up paying for the version of it he found. The series keeps returning to this shape. Someone who fights inside a collapsing world wins the specific battle and watches the era dissolve regardless. Blackbeard's death in 1718 is the sequence that justifies the entire historical enterprise. The engagement at Ocracoke Inlet is documented by multiple contemporary accounts, 5 pistol shots and more than 20 sword wounds before he finally fell. The game tracks this with more fidelity than the series typically affords its borrowed figures. He was performing right up until the performance ended. The larger tension in the game is one Black Flag arrives at honestly, and then half sidesteps. The geopolitical gap was real. Competing empires had temporarily lost the ability to enforce control, and independent operators filled it. The freedom versus empire reading of what Nassau meant, though, arrived considerably later. The pirates left behind almost no documentation of their political philosophy, and the flat-out libertarian republic framing is more retrospective construction than contemporary account. Worth naming that leap, precisely because the real Nassau is already interesting enough without the extra layer. The pattern from the section before this one holds here too. Blackbeard was generating his own mythology in real time, the same way Borgia became cultural shorthand for an entire era of political rot while the family was still inside it. The gap between what actually happened and what got remembered has been widening with every rung. The empires eventually closed the gap in the Caribbean and erased the space where the experiment had lived. Then the empires turned on each other, and the bill for that particular fight landed on people the official histories spent considerable effort not counting. The 7 Years' War. Shay Cormac spends Assassin's Creed, Rogue hunting down his own former brotherhood, and the war raging around him barely needs him to make anyone dead. The 7 Years' War ran from 1754 to 1763, and it is often treated as the first conflict fought on a genuinely global scale, with fighting stretching from North American forests to European battlefields to colonial waters on multiple continents. Rogue drops its player into the tail end of that machine, in the same North Atlantic and Caribbean waters where the previous era let pirates carve out their own kingdoms in the gaps between empires. Those gaps close here. Every port, every stretch of open water, every colonial outpost that once ran on local hustle now answers to a war effort with its own supply lines, its own fleets, its own chain of command stretching back to London and Versailles. Shay wants to protect people from a catastrophe he genuinely believes is coming, and the price is his brotherhood, his name among former friends, and any claim to the kind of freedom a pirate captain enjoyed one rung down the ladder. The empire that used to leave room for men like that now needs every man, every ship, and every mile of coastline accounted for. Nothing in the historical record credits a secret order with shaping how the war unfolded, and Rogue never really tries to claim otherwise. What the game does convincingly is use the war's scale as pressure, squeezing the exact kind of independent operator the series just spent an entry glorifying. Follow that pattern far enough, and the fictional order stops looking like a hidden hand steering empires and starts looking like something empires simply have room for less and less of. That is a reach the game leaves you to make on your own, but it tracks with everything the series does next. Wars this large do not stay confined to soldiers and generals for long. Eventually, the people footing the bill decide a crate of taxed cargo or a coat with the wrong crown stitched on it makes a perfectly good place to aim their anger. The French Revolution. France turned a prison riot into its national birthday, and the prison had exactly 7 inmates left inside when the mob broke through. That is the detail that gets lost under the fireworks. July 14th, 1789 is remembered as the day Paris rose up and smashed tyranny, and the date became Bastille Day, the holiday that still shuts the whole country down every summer. The actual building held 7 prisoners that morning, mostly counterfeiters and 2 men locked up for insanity, hardly the siege of legend. The garrison surrendered within hours. What the crowd actually stormed was a symbol of royal power that had been hollowing out for years, and the fortress fell faster than the myth built on top of it. Assassin's Creed. Unity drops its players straight into that collapse, and the game earns real credit for the scale of it. The Paris it builds is packed, loud, and genuinely dangerous, with crowds that surge through the streets and turn quiet corners into ambushes on their own. That crowd system is the strongest historical trick Unity pulls off. It makes the revolution feel like weather, something moving through the city whether any single person wants it to or not. The empire running the Caribbean piracy trade, a rung back, kept its machinery offshore, out of sight of the people it exploited. Paris put its collapse on every street corner at once. Nobles who ran institutions built over generations watched their authority evaporate in a matter of months, replaced by assemblies, then committees, then men willing to send former allies to the guillotine to prove loyalty to the new order. The reign of terror grew straight out of that instability, a stretch where holding power one week guaranteed nothing the next. Somewhere inside that crowd is an operative trying to steady a revolution that was moving faster than any single agent could steer, and the city keeps moving whether he succeeds or not. Unity's Paris turns that whole process into something you can watch happen at street level, a symbol falling in public while the deeper machinery of power kept grinding underneath it, slower, quieter, and far harder to kill. After a crowd topples a symbol, the next transformation needs no mob and no monument. It arrives through a clock and a wage, and it decides how ordinary people work and survive from the inside of their own routines. Victorian London. London in the 1860s held more people than any other city on Earth at the time, and likely more than any city in history, and it kept growing by feeding entire neighborhoods into its own machinery. Assassin's Creed. Syndicate drops its story into that machine, and the game's biggest character ends up being the plumbing, running under kings, mobs, and everyone else who thought they were in charge. The Underground opened in 1863 as the world's first subterranean railway, hauling passengers by the tens of thousands through tunnels dug beneath streets that had been open sewers a few years earlier. Factories along the Thames ran day and night on coal and child labor, turning out textiles, weapons, and machine parts for an empire that would eventually stretch across a quarter of the globe. Telegraph wires, gas lighting, and rail lines spread through the city faster than any council could regulate them, and the profits stacked up in the same square mile of banks that had long held London's money. London's population stood at nearly 3 million by 1861, making it the largest city on the planet, and its water supply came from a river so contaminated that the summer of 1858 earned itself the nickname the Great Stink, because the smell made Parliament almost unbearable, driving MPs to rush through sewer reform in 18 days, a genuinely impressive achievement for a river. The class divide paying for all of it sat in plain view. Industrialists built townhouses in Westminster, while families in Whitechapel and Southwark packed 6 or 7 people into a single room with a shared pump for water. Child labor in the factories was legal, common, and cheap, and a 13-year-old working a loom for 12 hours could lose fingers to a machine that ran on the same schedule 6 days a week. The mob in the last chapter filled the streets demanding bread. This one filled the streets with soot and traded the guillotine for a factory whistle that meant the same thing: get back to work or get replaced. That swap is what makes syndicates stand apart. The rails and the gaslight carry the plot themselves, because the systems moving coal, money, and people through London decide who eats before any assassin gets a say. A hidden blade finds a seat inside a machine that size, not the controls that run it. A city rebuilt around track schedules and factory bells leaves one question sitting open before an older kind of power shows up trying to hold its own borders together against something bigger. What happens when a fading kingdom collides with a structure expanding right through it until every local decision becomes one more weight in a much larger collapse? Ptolemaic Egypt. A kingdom's entire future got decided by a knife fight inside a Roman Senate house, and nobody in Alexandria got a vote. Assassin's Creed. Origins drops its player into Ptolemaic Egypt in the final decades of the 1st century BCE, right as the dynasty that had ruled since Alexander the Great's generals carved up his empire started coming apart at the seams. The throne in Alexandria was shaking already. Then a group of senators in Rome stabbed Julius Caesar 23 times on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, and the shaking turned into a full collapse. That instability reached back decades before Caesar's assassination to Cleopatra's own father, Ptolemy XII, who drained Egypt's treasury, bribing Roman senators to keep Rome from annexing the kingdom outright, then needed a Roman army to put him back on his throne after his subjects threw him out. Egypt had been leaning on Rome as a crutch for over 20 years before Caesar ever set foot in Alexandria. The era before this one collapsed through railway lines and factory floors. Egypt's collapse ran through a Senate house and a debt it could never repay. Caesar's death is a Roman story, a cautionary tale about ambition and betrayal that ends with Brutus holding a bloody knife. It is also an Egyptian tragedy, but Cleopatra had tied her kingdom's survival to Caesar personally, and his assassination stripped away the personal relationship Cleopatra had counted on to keep Rome's civil wars away from Egypt. Zero warning, zero transition plan, just a Senate floor covered in blood and a kingdom on the other side of the Mediterranean suddenly exposed. The Republic Caesar's killers claimed to be saving died with him instead. His death triggered a scramble over who would replace him, and that fight ran through Mark Antony, Octavian, and eventually straight through Egypt itself. Alexandria stopped being a Hellenistic capital making its own decisions and became a prize in someone else's war. The dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries could not survive contact with that. Calling this a single political collapse compresses 3 separate pressures into one. The real record shows 3 separate pressures landing at once: a Ptolemaic dynasty already unstable from internal succession fights, a Roman civil war spilling outward looking for territory, and a slow centuries-long handover of power from Hellenistic kingdoms to Rome that Egypt happened to be the last major holdout in. Origins folds all 3 into one dramatic turn because one turn plays better than 3. The turn is still built on something real. Somewhere in that folding is a person who inherited a crown built for a stronger Egypt and watched Rome turn her kingdom's ending into a footnote inside someone else's civil war. A kingdom can be pulled into an empire's collapse. The final test arrives when an entire world divides between rival cities and the crisis lasts long enough to become the era itself. The Peloponnesian War, Assassin's Creed. Odyssey opens with the single most legendary battle in Greek history, and then spends the rest of its runtime proving that legend was the easy part. Thermopylae in 480 BCE gives the game 300 Spartans, a mountain pass, and a death so mythologized it barely needs the game's help. That is the prologue. The real story starts decades later, inside a war that refused to end on schedule and took everyone it touched. The Peloponnesian War ran from 431 BCE to 404 BCE, 27 years of Athens and Sparta trading sieges, betrayals, and allies who switched sides more often than they changed cloaks. The war grinds through Sicily, through Corcyra, through a dozen city-states dragged in because geography made staying neutral impossible, before a decisive naval battle at Aegospotami in 405 BCE finally breaks the Athenian fleet and forces the surrender a year later. 27 years is long enough to bury the generation that started it. Then plague arrives inside Athens, packed behind its own walls by a strategy meant to outlast Spartan raids, and disease moves faster through a concentrated population than any spear thrown outside them. Pericles dies in 429 BCE, the statesman behind Athenian democracy's loudest era, killed by an outbreak his own city's defensive plan helped spread. The Golden Age does not outlive its architect. 27 years dwarfs the timeline of the collapse the previous chapter walked through. Ptolemaic Egypt buckling under one Roman assassination in 44 BCE. That collapse took a knife and a single afternoon in the Senate. This one takes a generation, a plague, and alliances that between them touch nearly every city-state in the Aegean. The gap between those two timelines is the entire point of putting them side by side. Odyssey layers a mercenary protagonist, a hidden cult, and a mythic bloodline on top of all that history, and the game never states outright that it is borrowing the war's shape rather than its verdict. Follow the pattern anyway. Athens still loses standing it never fully recovers. Sparta still wins a war it cannot actually capitalize on. The fictional order moves through the conflict like everyone else caught in it, picking sides, picking fights, earning none of the credit the historical record actually assigns. That is the answer this whole series has been circling since a mountain pass in 480 BCE, since a Senate floor in Rome, since every dynasty dressed up with hidden blades along the way. The player always finishes the mission. History still finishes the era. Pericles still dies in 429 BCE, Athens still spends its strength on a war it entered confident and left exhausted, and the Brotherhood's presence changes exactly none of it. The 27-year war sitting at the bottom of Assassin's Creed's timeline was always going to hold the whole weight, with or without an assassin standing in the wreckage. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.